The conference room was too quiet for what was about to happen. 12 people sat around a table built for board meetings, not family reckonings, and I set the folder down in the exact center of it.
No Islam. No speech.
Just the soft sound of paper meeting mahogany. Preston laughed first. He always did. "What is this?" he said, already reaching for it, already smiling like a man who'd been told his whole life that things worked out for him. "Some kind of consolation prize?" He opened it. "Read the first line." The laugh didn't finish leaving his throat. I watched it happen in real time, his eyes stopping halfway across the page, going back to the beginning, reading it again like the words might rearrange themselves into something less true. My father saw his face change before he even looked down. 40 years of running that company had taught him to read a room before he read a document. He looked at me instead. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. I didn't answer. "Not yet. Before I tell you what was on that page, I want to know something. If you're the one who always keeps the receipts, the one who does the right thing even when no one's watching, tell me where you're listening from right now. Drop your city, drop the time on your clock. And if this feels familiar already, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. Only if it's earned. Now, back to the folder. My name is Vivian Cole. I'm 36 years old, and by the time this story starts, I had spent 11 years becoming a person no one could talk over, a corporate attorney at one of the largest firms in Charlotte, the kind of job where partners twice my age asked for my red on a deal before they made a call. I bought my condo outright at 32.
Cash.
I didn't need anyone's name on my paperwork, and I didn't need anyone's permission to sign it. My father, Walter Cole, built Cole Precision Manufacturing from a single leased warehouse in 1987 into a company that supplied parts to half the automotive plants in the Southeast. He was the kind of man who measured love and output, who taught me to read a balance sheet before I could drive, who never once told me he was proud of me but told everyone else he was secondhand, like it was easier to say when I wasn't in the room. My brother, Preston, was 2 years younger and had never once had to prove he belonged anywhere. He'd worked at the company since he was 22, given a title of Vice President of Operations at 26, and a corner office before he'd finished a single fiscal year that turned a profit he was personally responsible for. He was charming in the way certain men are charming when they've never had to be anything else, quick with a joke, quicker with a compliment, the kind of golden that made people forget to check his math. I didn't resent him for it, not exactly. I understood the way you understand weather. Preston was the son who stayed. I was the daughter who left for law school and never quite came back, not all the way, not in the way that counted at that table. But I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened at that meeting. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't waiting for a chance to burn anything down. I had built a life that didn't require my father's company, his approval, or his money. I flew home for Thanksgiving. I sent birthday cards on time. When Cole Precision nearly lost its largest contract 8 years ago over a licensing dispute, I was the one who spent 3 unpaid weekends rewriting the agreement that saved it quietly from my apartment, because Walter asked and I never learned how to say no to him. I tell you all of this so you understand what I mean when I say I didn't go looking for a fight. I was simply the only person in that family who still read the fine print. The signs were never dramatic. That's the part people don't understand until it's happened to them. You don't get slammed doors. You get small omissions, repeated so consistently, they start to feel like weather instead of choice. When the regional director of compliance position opened at Cole Precision 3 years ago, I had the exact background for it. Manufacturing law, contract negotiation, a decade of experience my father's own general counsel didn't have. I applied through the proper channels, the way I'd handle any offer, because some part of me still believed the company ran on merit if you just did it right. Walter gave the role to a man named Curtis Boone, 41, no legal background, who had once been Preston's roommate at Clemson. It's not personal, Walter told me on the phone that night, in the same even voice he used for quarterly reports. Curtis knows the floor. He knows the people. I knew the contracts that kept the floor running. But I let it go, the way I always did. At the company's 30th anniversary dinner, Walter stood at the podium in front of 200 employees and thanked Preston by name for carrying this family's legacy forward. He didn't mention me. I was seated at table 6, third row back, close enough to hear him tell the man next to him, quietly, almost proudly, "That's my son right there." runs half this place now. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and my face doing exactly what it was trained to do. It was around that time I asked him, carefully over coffee, why he never once brought me into a leadership conversation about the company's future. He didn't even look up from his plate. "Vivian, you left," he said. "You built your own thing. Blood only counts when it's convenient, and you made it clear a long time ago what was convenient for you." I didn't argue. I never argued with him. I just filed it away the way I filed everything. What he never once mentioned, not that night, not any night after, was the licensing dispute 8 years earlier, the one that nearly cost Cole Precision its largest client and 20% of its annual revenue. I'd rewritten the entire agreement myself, unpaid, over 3 weekends, catching a termination clause his own attorney had missed. I'd emailed him the corrected draft at 1 a.m. on a Sunday. He'd replied 2 words.
Got it. Thanks.
That contract still governed the company's largest account. Nobody at that anniversary dinner knew my name was buried in its history. I didn't need the credit. I told myself that for years. But somewhere underneath the telling, I was keeping score, and I didn't even know it yet. The call came on a Tuesday mid-afternoon while I was between depositions. "We're having a family meeting," Walter said. 2 weeks from Friday. The Cole Precision boardroom, 9 a.m. "I want to get the succession plan formalized before the new fiscal year." "Succession," I repeated. "For Preston. Making it official." A pause, the kind he used when he already knew the answer wasn't going to satisfy me. "I want you there, Vivian. As a witness. Families should see this done properly. A witness. Not a participant. Not someone with a seat in the conversation, someone brought in to watch the conversation happen to other people." I told him I'd be there. That same week, Preston posted a photo of himself standing beside a new Range Rover, black on black, parked in front of the Cole Precision building like it belonged there. The caption read "Company's doing all right," followed by 3 fire emojis. He called our mother that night to tell her about it in detail, the financing, the trim package, the fact that Walter had personally co-signed. She called me afterward, delighted, to relay the whole story, like I'd want the play-by-play. I sat at my kitchen table that same evening with a cup of tea going cold beside a banker's box I'd pulled from my hall closet, 8 years of old case files, contracts, and correspondence I'd never had a reason to throw away. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I told myself I was just organizing. Near the bottom, in a folder labeled with nothing but a date, I found the licensing agreement I'd rewritten years ago. I read through it slowly, the way you reread something you wrote when you were a different version of yourself. One clause caught my eye in a way it never had before. I read it twice. Then a third time, more carefully, the way I read things when a client's entire case is about to turn on 11 words nobody else noticed. I closed the folder and sat very still for a long moment. 2 days before the meeting, Preston called me. He never called just to talk, so I knew before I answered that this was going to be about him. "Hey, so I know Dad said it's just a formality, but I wanted to give you a heads up," he said, breezy the way he said everything. "I already signed the paperwork with our tax guy last week. For the transfer. Dad wanted it clean before the meeting, so there's no, confusion on the day." "Confusion?" I said. "You know, just smooth. I didn't want you walking in and thinking there was still something to discuss." I told him that made sense. I told him I was happy for him. Both were true, in the careful, technical way things can be true without being the whole truth. That same afternoon, I ran into Doris Ambrose at the grocery store, Walter's longtime bookkeeper, retired now, but close enough to the family that she still got a Christmas card every year with her name spelled right. She hugged me, asked about the firm, and then, almost as an afterthought while we stood by the produce, she said something that snagged in my mind like a thread catching on a nail. "You know, I always wondered whatever happened with those old partnership papers. Your daddy used to keep them in that fireproof box in his office. Haven't thought about those in years." I asked her what she meant. She waved it off, already distracted by a coupon in her hand. "Oh, nothing, honey. Just old business. Before your time, probably." It wasn't nothing. I knew it wasn't nothing the moment she said it. The way you know a word is misspelled before you can say which letter is wrong. I told myself it was nothing anyway. Old files. An old woman's memory playing tricks. I had a meeting to prepare for, and I didn't have time to chase down a comment made between the lettuce and the checkout line. I should have chased it anyway. The Cole Precision boardroom smelled like fresh coffee and cold air conditioning, the same as every quarterly meeting I'd sat through since I was old enough to be invited. But this time there were name cards. This time there was a court reporter's laptop set up quietly in the corner, and beside it sat Harold Denning, the family's estate attorney, 60-something, silver-haired, a man who drafted my grandfather's will and now, apparently, mine. Beside him sat someone I didn't expect.
Ed Marsh.
Walter's old business partner from the earliest days of the company, retired for a decade, the kind of man who showed up to things because Walter asked him to and never asked why. I sat down at the far end of the table. Preston sat closest to our father, already loosening his tie like a man settling in for a celebration rather than a meeting. Walter stood. He didn't sit the whole time he spoke, the way he never sat during anything he considered important. I've spent 40 years building something, he said, looking mostly at the middle distance, the way he did when he'd rehearsed a speech in his head more than once. And I want to make sure it's in the right hands going forward. He nodded at Harold. Harold slid 2 folders across the table, one thick, one thin. Effective today, Walter said, full ownership of Cole Precision Manufacturing, its assets, its accounts, and the family holdings transfer to Preston. Preston's hand was already on the thick folder before Walter finished the sentence. Vivian, Walter continued, and I watched him choose his next words the way a man chooses a bridge he already knows is out, will receive a one-time distribution of $50,000 in recognition of her education and her independence.
$52,000.
The thin folder sat untouched in front of me. Ed Marsh shifted in his seat. Harold Denning did not look up from his papers. Nobody said anything for a long moment. I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. That's it, I said. My voice came out even. Steady. The voice I use in depositions when I already know something the other side doesn't. Vivian, we talked about this, Walter said. You have your own career. Your own life. This company was never going to be yours to run. Preston wasn't even looking at me. He was already reading the transfer terms, already smiling at numbers that had never once had my name attached to them. The Cole Precision boardroom smelled like fresh coffee and cold air conditioning, the same as every quarterly meeting I'd sat through since I was old enough to be invited. But this time there were name cards. This time there was a court reporter's laptop set up quietly in the corner, and beside it sat Harold Denning, the family's estate attorney, 60-something, silver-haired, a man who drafted my grandfather's will and now, apparently, mine. Beside him sat someone I didn't expect.
Ed Marsh.
Walter's old business partner from the earliest days of the company, retired for a decade, the kind of man who showed up to things because Walter asked him to and never asked why. I sat down at the far end of the table. Preston sat closest to our father, already loosening his tie like a man settling in for a celebration rather than a meeting. Walter stood. He didn't sit the whole time he spoke, the way he never sat during anything he considered important. I've spent 40 years building something, he said, looking mostly at the middle distance, the way he did when he'd rehearsed a speech in his head more than once. And I want to make sure it's in the right hands going forward. He nodded at Harold. Harold slid 2 folders across the table, one thick, one thin. Effective today, Walter said, full ownership of Cole Precision Manufacturing, its assets, its accounts, and the family holdings transfer to Preston. Preston's hand was already on the thick folder before Walter finished the sentence. Vivian, Walter continued, and I watched him choose his next words the way a man chooses a bridge he already knows is out, will receive a one-time distribution of $50,000 in recognition of her education and her independence.
$52,000.
The thin folder sat untouched in front of me. Ed Marsh shifted in his seat. Harold Denning did not look up from his papers. Nobody said anything for a long moment. I could hear the air conditioning cycle on. That's it, I said. My voice came out even. Steady. The voice I use in depositions when I already know something the other side doesn't. Vivian, we talked about this, Walter said. You have your own career. Your own life. This company was never going to be yours to run. Preston wasn't even looking at me. He was already reading the transfer terms, already smiling at numbers that had never once had my name attached to them. Preston leaned back in his chair, the thick folder resting under one hand like a trophy he'd already had engraved. "Come on, Viv," he said, and I watched the smile settle in like he thought it was kind. "You've always been the quiet one, the smart one. You never wanted the stuff anyway, the plant floor, the union meetings, the 2 a.m. calls when a shipment's stuck at the border. You've got your own thing going. This just makes sense." I hadn't said I wanted the plant floor. I hadn't said anything at all. I remember, I said, the licensing dispute. 8 years ago. The one that almost cost this company its largest account. Preston blinked, momentarily thrown. The way people are when a conversation doesn't go where they'd already decided it would go. That was before my time, wasn't it? I rewrote the agreement myself, I said. 3 weekends. Unpaid. I found a termination clause your own counsel missed. The one that would have let the client walk with 0 notice. I emailed Dad the fix at 1 a.m. on a Sunday. Walter's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the way it did when a number came in under projection. That contract, I continued, is still the one governing this company's largest account.
Today. Right now.
While we're sitting in this room. "Nobody's saying you haven't been helpful," Walter said, and there it was again, helpful. A word he used for vendors, for consultants, for anyone whose contribution he intended to compensate and then forget. But helping and building are 2 different things, Vivian. Preston's been here. Every day. Every year. You made your choice a long time ago. I made a choice to leave and build something of my own, I said. I didn't choose to be erased from something I helped save. Blood only counts when it's convenient, Walter said again, sharper this time, no longer offering it like an observation but wielding it like a verdict. And it wasn't convenient for you to be here. The room went very still. Ed Marsh looked down at the table. Harold Denning's pen had stopped moving across his legal pad entirely. I thought about every version of myself that would have cried in that chair. Every version that would have raised her voice, listed every slight out loud, begged the room to see her. I wasn't going to be any of those women. Not today. I understand, I said instead, and my voice didn't shake, not once. I appreciate you being honest about where I stand. Preston, emboldened by my silence, mistaking composure for surrender, slid the thick folder an inch closer to himself, like he was afraid the room might still take it back. No hard feelings, right? You'll still come to Sunday dinners and stuff. I didn't answer that. I reached down instead into the leather bag at my feet and set a single folder of my own on the table. Not the thin one Harold had given me.
Mine.
8 years ago, that termination clause wasn't the only thing I found buried in that agreement. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, the licensing draft open on one screen, and, beside it, a scanned stack of Cole Precision's founding documents Walter had asked me to organize for a bank refinancing, decades-old paperwork nobody had touched since the company's original incorporation in 1987. Most of it was routine, articles of organization, early tax filings, the kind of dust nobody expects to matter. But one document was different. A private partnership agreement, drafted the same year the company was founded, between Walter and a silent investor who'd put up nearly a third of the initial capital when the banks wouldn't. My mother, not as a wife with implied rights, as a named party, in writing, with a clause stating that her ownership interest and, upon her death, its inheritance, could not be unilaterally reassigned without the written consent of her legal heirs. My mother passed away when I was 26. Nobody had ever mentioned that agreement again. I assumed, the way you assume things about paperwork that predates you, that it had been dissolved, bought out, folded into some later restructuring I simply hadn't seen. I'd photographed every page that night, filed the images the way I filed everything, carefully, without urgency, the reflex of a lawyer who keeps records out of habit rather than intention. I didn't mention it to Walter.
There was no reason to.
It was old business, the kind Doris Ambrose would later call it, standing in a grocery store aisle beside the lettuce. Sitting in that hall closet weeks earlier, Rereading that same agreement with older eyes and a decade more experience, I read the consent clause a third time and understood fully for the first time what it meant. Walter had never bought out that clause. He had simply stopped mentioning it existed, which meant the 20% ownership stake it protected hadn't vanished. It had passed, quietly, on paper he'd forgotten I'd ever seen, directly to me. I want to pause here and ask you something. If you'd found that folder years before anyone else knew it existed, proof that something you'd been shut out of was legally, provably yours, what would you have done? Said nothing and let them celebrate? Or open a folder that same day? Tell me honestly in the comments. I'll wait right here. I slid the folder past Preston, past Walter. I said it directly in front of Harold Denning. Mr. Denning, I said, before this meeting closes, I'd like the record to reflect something. Can you review this document and confirm its authenticity for me? Harold looked at me, then at the folder, the practiced neutrality of a man who'd spent 40 years not reacting to anything in this family. He opened it. Preston laughed, that same easy laugh from the day it all started, the one that assumed nothing in this room could touch him. What is that, Viv, your consolation speech in writing? He reached over and turned the folder toward himself before Harold could stop him. Read the header. Read the first line. The laugh died somewhere in his throat. This is a partnership agreement, Harold said slowly, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Recognition, then calculation, then the particular stillness of a lawyer realizing he is standing on ground that just moved. Naming Elaine Cole as a capital partner, with a consent clause governing reassignment of her interest upon death. Nobody breathed. That's my mother's stake, I said. 20%. Never bought out. Never dissolved. Passed to her legal heir under the exact terms of that clause, on the exact date this company was originally founded. Walter's face had gone the color of the folder itself. Where did you get that? He whispered. You gave me the box, Dad. 8 years ago. Asked me to organize it for the refinancing. My voice stayed level. Steady. The same voice I'd used in that room the whole meeting. I've had it since. I just never had a reason to open it again until now. Preston's eyes moved from the page to our father, waiting for him to say it wasn't true. Walter said nothing at all. You said blood only counts when it's convenient, I said, and I let the words land the way he'd let them land on me. So, let's talk about what's actually mine. Harold Denning didn't look up right away. He turned back a page, then forward again, the reflex of a man checking his own certainty before he'd let it out into the room. This appears to be a validly executed agreement, he said finally, with a properly recorded consent clause. I'd need to confirm it against the county filings, but on its face, yes. This is enforceable. Preston's hand was still on the folder. He hadn't moved it since Harold started speaking, like letting go might make the words stop being true. That can't be right, he said. His voice had lost its ease. Dad. Tell him that's not right. Walter didn't answer. He was looking at the table now, not at either of us. You've had this for 8 years? Preston asked me, and for the first time all morning, the charm was gone entirely, stripped down to something younger and more frightened underneath it. You just sat on it? While I built my whole career here thinking. He stopped himself. I watched him understand, in real time, what he'd almost said out loud, that everything he'd built his identity on, the corner office, the title, the certainty that all of it was simply his, had never once required him to ask whether it was. He wasn't angry at me. Not really. I could see that even then. He was afraid, the particular fear of a man realizing the ground he'd never questioned might not hold his weight. Ed Marsh cleared his throat quietly and looked at Walter. Walt. Elaine's stake. I remember she put in the equipment financing that first year. I always wondered what happened to that. Walter still didn't speak. 40 years of controlling every room he'd ever walked into, and he sat there in silence while the truth did what he never could. It settled the matter without him. I'm not here to take the company from him, I said, looking at Walter, then at Preston. I don't want Sunday dinners built on pretending this didn't happen, and I don't want a title I never asked for out of guilt. I closed my folder. What I want is simple. A formal buyout of my mother's stake at fair market valuation, independently assessed, not negotiated across this table. Or, if Preston would rather run this company alongside an actual partner instead of a ghost he forgot existed, a real seat on the board. Either one. Your choice. Not today. I stood, tucking the folder back into my bag. You have 30 days, I said. You know where to find me. You always have. I walked out of that boardroom the same way I walked in, steady, unhurried, no one's witness but my own. 6 months later, Cole Precision Manufacturing looks different on paper, even if the building on Route 9 still looks the same. The buyout took 11 weeks to finalize. In the end, Preston chose the seat instead of the check, told Harold Denning he'd rather have a real partner than a debt he'd spend the next decade paying off. I don't think he did it out of generosity. I think he did it because, for the first time, someone made him ask what things actually cost. I hold 20% of this company now, formally. On paper, my mother's name is finally attached to. I don't run the floor. I don't sit in on the 2 a.m. shipment calls. I show up quarterly, review the contracts nobody else reads closely enough, and I sign my own name to things now, not in service of someone else's legacy, but as a partner in mine. Ed Marsh told me over coffee last month that the other longtime partners look at Preston differently these days. Not with hostility. With a kind of quiet recalculation, the way people look at a number they'd rounded up for years and finally checked. Walter emailed me in March. For lines, no apology in them exactly, but an opening. Asterisk, I found some of your mother's old files. Thought you might want them. Asterisk, I wrote back and told him I would. I didn't take that company from anyone. I just stopped letting them decide what was mine. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one who was told your love didn't count unless it was convenient, I hope you're taking notes tonight, not just listening. Tell me in the comments, what's your folder? And if this one hit home, subscribe. I've got more stories like it waiting for you.